The field of communication studies has grown a lot in recent years and also acquired greater visibility in the humanities, social, and behavioral sciences. With that comes the problematic of trying to explain the scope and the worth of the field to other academic communities. What are the challenges and opportunities involved in that? About this and many other fascinating topics is this conversation with Jillian Báez in this new episode of El Café Latinx. What's the experience of being a Latinx scholar in the field of communication and media studies? What are the main challenges and opportunities that come with our identities? These are the issues that we'll talk about in El Café Latinx, where some of the leading voices in the field will share their professional experiences. Hola, my name is Pablo Boczkowski. I teach at Northwestern University, where I hold the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Chair in Communication. Together with Mora Matassi, doctoral student at Northwestern and executive producer of this podcast, we invite you to discover the journeys of scholars who are at the cutting edge of creating knowledge about Latinx communication across the Americas. These are our stories. Esas son nuestras historias. Estas son nuestras historias. Welcome everybody to this new episode of El Café Latinx. We are joined today by Jillian Báez. Jillian is an associate professor in the Department of Africana and Puerto Rican Latino Studies at Hunter College in the City University of New York. She is also a faculty affiliate in the Latin American and Caribbean Studies program and in the Women's and Gender Studies program of the Graduate Center, both at the City University of New York, as well as a faculty affiliate at the Mexican Studies Institute. Before that, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Media Culture at the College of Staten Island in the City University of New York as well. And before then, she held positions at the University of Michigan and at Williams College. She did her BA at City University of New York, so she's now a professor at her alma mater, and her PhD at the Institute for Communications Research at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her first book, In Search of Belonging, Latinas, Media and Citizenship, published by the University of Illinois Press, was extremely well received and was awarded the 2019 Bonnie Ritter Award for Outstanding Feminist Book of the National Communication Association. She is the guest editor of two special issues, most recently in Latino Studies, a special section that's a tribute to my colleague Frances Aparicio. She's the author of many journal articles, most recently in Latino Studies, Communication, Culture, and Critique, and Chicana Latina Studies Journal. Jillian, it is truly a pleasure to have you with us in El Café Latinx.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. So tell us, how did it all begin? That is, how was the start of the journey that led you to become a professor?
My journey begins as an undergraduate student. I majored in communications, not fully knowing what that meant. I came from a working class family, and my parents really just wanted me to go to college and select a major that would get me a job. And so I started off, I thought, okay, communications, you could work in, various forms of media. The thought of being a journalist sort of appealed to me before I knew what the job market was for that. Luckily enough, the major that I was in, you took both theory and production courses. And what I came to find was that I really enjoyed, the courses that talked about media theory, the courses that dealt with history of different media. And I liked them more so than the production courses. I did okay in the production courses, but I had certainly gone into it thinking that, I want to be a media producer. And it turned out to be the other way. But I didn't know what that interest meant until, two things happened by circumstance. One is, while I was an undergraduate, Federico Suberbi, who was a major figure, in Latino communication, happened to teach for, I think, a year or two in New York City. And he happens to be looking for an undergraduate research assistant. And so through a number of networks at CUNY, I saw this ad, we were put in touch with one another. And he was really the first scholar that I ever met who worked in this area. And I was pleasantly surprised to find out that you could make a career out of this. I had already added on a double major. I was majoring in what was then Black and Puerto Rican Studies. Our department name has shifted since then. And so I was sort of thinking about how those two areas of communications and ethnic studies, how they overlap, particularly in terms of thinking about Latino studies. But really, I hadn't seen that model before until I met Federico Suberbi. And then, following that, maybe the next semester, I took a course called Women in Media. And we happened to be reading Ángela Valdivia's book, Latina in the Land of Hollywood. I had never read really anything specifically about Latinos in media prior to having, met Federico Suberbi. And certainly had never seen any of that work on the syllabi for the classes that I was taking. So I turned that book around to see who, to look at the little blurb about who the author is. And it says, okay, she's Ángela Valdivia. She's at the University of Urbana-Champaign. And I remember thinking, where is Urbana-Champaign? What is this Urbana? That was totally, outside of my geographic understanding of the world. And so I looked her up. And luckily, this was at the point where you could look people up, and they had a little page, although it wasn't, I don't think it was immediately attached to her email. So I had to do a little bit of work to figure out how to get in touch with her, but I did. And I wrote her a note saying, I loved the book. Maybe I was thinking about graduate school, and she wrote me back right away and had said, let's talk. You should think about graduate school. And that's, how the journey began for me.
All right. So you had a great mentor and a great inspirational figure at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So you went straight from CUNY to UIUC, or did you apply to other programs? How was the transition?
I did apply to other programs. I had applied to a number of them across the country. And for me, I was accepted to a handful. So I did have some choices, but for me, there were two things guiding my decision. One was, a number of people had said to me, it's really important that you go somewhere that has faculty that can work in the area that you want to go into. And so, I had wanted to go to UC San Diego, but the faculty member that I would have been working with had revealed to me that she was going to leave the next year, which I did appreciate. And so that was extremely useful information. And so that determined some of it. And then the other issue, to be honest with you, was, coming from a working class background, I knew that wherever I went, I was going to have to pay my own way, so to speak. And Urbana-Champaign seemed like a perfect place because Ángela Valdivia was there. Isabel Molina Guzman had also been recently hired as a junior faculty member. And there were a number of people there working on race and ethnicity, working on international communication. So I felt like it was going to be the best fit for me. Plus, they offered a really good, package for me to continue for the first 5 years. And honestly, Urbana-Champaign is a very cheap place to live. And so I'm not going to lie and say that was also a factor in making my decision.
And so how was the experience there?
It was, on the one hand, unlike anything else I had experienced geographically. I mean, this is, I was born and raised in New York City. And I really, at that point in my life, had not traveled much either, other than to Puerto Rico, which is where my family was from. And so, and maybe Florida, again, because we had family that had migrated there. And so, Urbana-Champaign is 2 hours, as I'm sure you know, from Chicago. And, and on the way there, there's nothing but cornfields. So, that was different. And it was certainly, it is a small, it's a small college town, so to speak. But I will say this, one of the things that I loved, and I still, think about it in very nostalgic ways, is that it was a space where it had just like an amazing community of scholars, and you met people from all over the world that I feel like otherwise I never would have engaged with, on both an intellectual level, but also on a personal level. And so I always hold that very dear in my heart. And for me, I mean, it might sound strange thinking about, someone so urban going to that kind of setting, but it was exactly what I needed for graduate school. And I still, I joke with people that every once in a while, I still have dreams about being at Urbana-Champaign, going to the little cafes. So it definitely was formative for me, but also holds a special place in my heart.
That's wonderful. Yes, I was thinking, I didn't know that you were born and raised in New York, but from an undergraduate at Hunter College to Urbana, that's a significant urban transition, urban to rural, I mean, at this point, right? So, and then when it came time to go on the job market, before that, did you know that you wanted a career in academia, or did you also consider careers outside of academia after your PhD?
Yeah, I mean, I think, by the time I had started graduate school, I don't think I really fully understand what it implied. I was primarily there for intellectual reasons, right? This was really interesting. These topics were really interesting to me. So I just wanted to go more in depth. And I felt like I had been afforded this opportunity to do that. But I don't think it was until maybe my second or third year where I applied for a fellowship. And my advisor asked me, like, well, what do you want to do after this? Like, do you want to work at a teaching college, or do you want to be at a more research intensive university, like, or something else? What is your plan? And it was at that point that I really had to think about, oh, that's right. I had been preparing specifically for, a role in academia. And I realized that that was what I wanted to do. And that I just needed to sort of figure out, how I would kind of meld my research and teaching interests. And will say this, I had known that I did not want to go into media production pretty early on, because while I was an undergraduate, I did work in those kinds of roles as a production assistant, as a publicity assistant. So I had already a sense that I knew I didn't really want to go into that. And as I went further along into graduate school, it was further solidified for me that I really wanted to focus on research and teaching.
Okay. And then going on the academic labor market, how was that?
That was not easy. And some of it had to do, of course, with timing. So in my case, I finished my PhD in 2019. And so when I really went on the job market that year before, as I was finishing the dissertation in 2018, that is when there was a huge economic crisis. And so literally, like, I remember that fall, or 2008, not 2018. That
exactly,
fall, yeah, no, 2008. I remember there actually being some jobs. I mean, of course, it was always competitive, but there were some to apply to. And then by December, January coming, and search committees reaching out and saying, we're so sorry, this position no longer exists. We're not even going to interview folks. And that continued for another good maybe 2 years. And I was lucky to be able to find in the meantime positions, so to speak. So I had a postdoc immediately following, which I was very grateful for, and gave me an opportunity to regroup. And then later was visiting. So it was not easy. It was not easy also too, because I had to move, right? So I was going from Illinois to then I did a dissertation fellowship in Albany, New York, and then going back to the Midwest for a postdoc at Michigan. And then I got a visiting position at Williams. And then finally, after that, got my tenure track position at CUNY. So it was a very long journey. And it was, I don't want to paint it as an easy road. But at the same time, I think, graduate students should know that the one thing that I could have told myself, what I wish if I were to go back, and I would tell myself, is to remember that, some of this has to do with luck, but also too, you need to be prepared, because when the opportunity does arise, you want to be ready, right, to go in and have a really clear sense of what it is that you're offering, and also that you're looking for. I think that we have to have, that sense as well. And I think that search committees are looking for that sense of purpose.
How did you come up with yours? I mean, it's not easy, and it's not easy, especially at the beginning of one's career. How did you figure out what you wanted and how to present yourself in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it took me a while to figure that out, and that got easier as the years went on. I think for me, and I think that many people face this as they finish, it's hard to think about what your research agenda is beyond your dissertation, right? And publishing your dissertation, whether that's in book form or article form. So it took me a while to really figure out, okay, where do I want to go next? What conversations do I want to enter in the field, in communications? I think also too, to be honest, in my case, and certainly this is the case of a number of folks in communications, I also had to think about too how different fields would perceive my work. And I say that because, I was interviewing for jobs in communications, and even within communications, that can be all over the place, right? There are some departments where they're following like a mass communication model. Others are, do mostly interpersonal or organizational, and you may be the only person who looks at media. And so you have to think about that they, so thinking about that within communications, but then also, some of us, in my case, I think at one point I had interviewed for an American Studies job, certainly, ethnic studies jobs, Latino studies jobs, sometimes women's studies, and all of those, you have folks from really different disciplines then looking in on your work. And many of them, I think that this is the challenge outside of communication, don't know a lot about communication, right? So they see a communication scholar and they're like, wow, that's really interesting and it seems really relevant, but they don't know how to make sense of it. So you do have to, one of the things I learned pretty early on is I had to figure out how to translate what it is, not only that I do, but what we do as communication scholars to, to colleagues who are not, communication scholars. And I find myself still doing that, in my role now, where I'm amongst, which I love my colleagues, but, I am the only communication scholar. So I oftentimes do have to tell them, well, in the field we do this, or this is what we focus on. So I think that that's a big part of it. I think what also, in terms of how to present yourself, I think that one of the best things that you can do is know what your strengths are. And sometimes you have to talk to other people to figure that out early on in your career. It means that you may have to talk to senior people and ask them, what do you see my strengths as a scholar? And what are really my areas of expertise? Because I think many times we think about our work more narrowly than it really is. And I think, because you're going to be talking to other scholars in other areas within communication, or sometimes completely outside of communication, you have to have a broader view sort of what it is that you do. And I think it helps to kind of bounce those ideas off of other people. And then I'm not going to lie to, what also helps is just experience. I will say this, one of the hardest questions that, recent PhDs get asked are around service and teaching, and they may just not have enough experience, right, to answer those questions as in depth as they can. So with those, I think, the best you can do is just sort of do your research, and have a plan for how you might answer some of those questions, but also be kind of gentle on yourself too, because you just don't have it yet, but eventually you will, right? And then, it changes from this is what I would do to this is what I have done in, X or Y circumstances. But it's tough.
No, and it's a fascinating set of answers. I have a couple of follow-up questions. First one is, you've been very successful at sort of, as you said, translating or articulating the value of communication research to scholars outside of the field. What are some of the do's and don'ts of doing that, in your experience, at least?
The do's and don'ts. I think one of the do's is you do have to give folks a little, you have to let them know that the sort of contours of the field. What I mean by that is you have to let them know, in communications, you know, we study, right, these various forms of messaging, or however you want to phrase that, or language, but letting people know that there are these different areas within communication, right? Like there's face-to-face communication versus looking at media, which are really different. And that's a very crude way of talking about the field, but sometimes you have to do that because really I think folks assume that this is the feedback I've often gotten. Their only knowledge of communications oftentimes is that it's a popular major, and the assumption is that students who otherwise do not do well end up becoming communications majors, right? So that's like what the athletes take on, right? For example, that's a stereotype people have. So you have to sort of, explain to them that this is actually a discipline of study. It is rigorous. And also it's not as new as people think. So oftentimes, I do mention how, this has been systematically studied in a US context, for example, since at least the 1930s. And when you talk about sort of propaganda studies, people start to get, especially I think now in our political moment. But I think people need to know that. And also too, I remind them, and this is an area of study that's taken seriously, like throughout the world. People are always surprised, when I say, some of the strongest research comes from Latin America, and people are shocked. And I'm like, no, really? I mean, some of the top scholars, that is where the work comes from. It's not the only place, but so I think that's definitely a do. I think I'm trying to think of a don't here. I would say the don't is, don't assume that they know anything about communication. Do not assume that they necessarily take it seriously. And also too, don't assume that they know that it's interdisciplinary. There's a few times when I've had to explain to folks, that there are people in the field who do very interpretive research, right? So they're doing like text, very close reading of text, for examples. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have super, quantitative social scientific folks, and everybody in between. And I think, people just don't know that. So I don't make any assumptions.
Okay, that's excellent. And then, so as you said, you had a postdoctoral position at Michigan, right? And you had a visiting position at Williams,
Mm-hmm.
and then you went back to CUNY.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you compare your experience at a very sort of elite but very, very big public institution, at an elite and small private institution like Williams, and at a place like CUNY, which is the hallmark of sort of upwards mobility through education, at least in this country, probably is the foremost institution for that historically, at least. I see the University of New York has played a tremendous role in that space, and you are now at the crown jewel of the CUNY system. So how does it compare to be on the faculty and in all these places?
Yeah, they have been very different experiences. I mean, certainly at Michigan, Michigan is research driven. Everyone is focused on research. And even when you teach undergraduate students, everything is all about integrating them into the research experience. And so, I mean, one of the positives is that Michigan just has so many resources, and there's so much training available there. If you want to strengthen your qualitative and quantitative skills, it's a great place to be. So as a postdoc, it worked out really well for me because it did give me some time to think about my research trajectory and to be pretty open about that in a place where everybody was thinking about research all the time. I mean, sometimes excessively, to be honest. After that, going to Williams, it felt like the complete opposite, because at Williams, yes, the scholars many of them there, very rigorous teacher scholars or scholar teachers. And so the faculty culture there was just so different. And I say that because people took research seriously at Williams, but they also took teaching as equally serious. It was also a place where people talked a lot about like pedagogical innovation, and like we used to have teaching lunches every week. And there are conversations I had there that I never had anywhere else. Because it is an elite liberal arts institution that is, very invested, right, in working with its undergraduates, and there are only undergraduates there, right? So really the focus is on undergraduates, which is really different from Michigan. And so, but I will say this, it made me a better teacher, and it taught me how to do seminars, because prior to that, I had been teaching, larger classes, 35 to 70 students, and at a public university, you cannot give, individual attention to everyone, right? That's just the way it is, because there's so many students, versus at Williams, these are tiny seminars with a few students. They get to know you really well as a scholar. They're really interested in your scholarship, which is very strange. Prior to that, right, no one really looks you up and knows what you do. But at Williams, they do. And they read everything so carefully. To the point that I would sometimes have to tell them, what page are we looking at? What are you? Because I was not accustomed to having the students read the readings so carefully. So I learned a lot about, how to work with those kinds of students. Also, too, those students have a lot of anxiety, I think, because they have a tremendous amount of pressure put on them that's a little different from the students that you might get at a public university. But it definitely was a learning experience. And I will say, for that time in my life, I enjoyed being in a smaller community, and getting to know the students in a much more deep way than I otherwise would have at a larger institution. And then CUNY just sort of threw me back out there. I didn't start at Hunter. I started at the College of Staten Island, which, for those of you who are not familiar with the New York City area, is technically a borough of New York City, but really in many ways is geographically isolated from the rest of the city, and also has its own cultural identity, that is probably for the conversation of another podcast episode. So that was it was an adjustment. There is like a very strong working class ethos and identity on Staten Island that I had not previously encountered at the other institutions I was at. And I needed to really think about that in the classroom. Just to give you an example, that's the first time that like a student has ever said to me, there's always a unit when you teach communication theory that looks at Marxism and neo-Marxism. And I would have students tell me, Professor, with their heavy Staten Island accents, and I say that with all the love in the world. This is the only place that anyone has ever said I don't have an accent is Staten Island. I'm a proletariat. I'm realizing now that so just to get that really resonated, right? And there was no other place really that I taught that resonated in that way. But at the same time could also be a place that was extremely like politically conservative, and also was much more diverse ethnically than I had anticipated. Like I knew it had been an Italian-American enclave and still continues to be for decades. But also there's a very old African-American community there. There's a Liberian community. There's a growing Latino community, specifically Mexican, but also Dominicans and Puerto Ricans that come from other boroughs, particularly Brooklyn, and a very large Arab American student population. It was like at 20%. And I had never taught in such a diverse classroom. So I would go in and honestly, I would not know what to expect. At the other institutions, I thought, okay, there's a number of ways this conversation could go, right? They could argue this, they could argue that. This I never knew. Every day that I went into the classroom, I never really knew where we were going to go because it was such a diverse classroom. Hunter, there are some similarities, but it's in Manhattan, and the students are, much more selective. The College of Staten Island is open admissions. Hunter is not. It is diverse in different ways, but yeah, I don't think there will ever be anything in my career quite like the College of Staten Island. So I'm appreciative for it. But it taught me that, where an institution is geographically located is really, really important and will really shape the way that you have to approach your teaching.
Absolutely. And how was to return to your alma mater, but now as a professor?
Oh, it's been amazing. I mean, I was never anticipating this happening. This was never, you have ideas in your mind of maybe where your career might go, but this was not. This was a complete sort of a wonderful detour. Yeah, no, it's been great. I mean, I will say so much has changed because, I'm coming back like almost 20 years later. And so, the institution has changed and grown in many ways. Um, but it's been really wonderful. It feels great to be able to come back in a really different kind of role and give back. I mean, I got so much from that from Hunter as an undergraduate. And so it's really wonderful, and I'm very grateful.
Excellent. Now, Jillian, you are a Latina who studies Latinx topics. Um, what's your perception of those topics and issues of positionality and representation in the broader field of communication? Where have you seen the conversation unfolding, and where do you think it should go next?
Yeah, I mean, I will say this. I am so happy to see the growing scholarship in this field. Even just in the last 10 years, it's grown tremendously. It's also wonderful too to see so many graduate students being trained in this area, because now we're sort of at that third generation level in terms of scholars being trained in Latina OX communication. I think that, one of the challenges, however, is I think within the wider field of communication, this is also often seen as like a topic instead of a subfield, right? That has intellectual traditions, that has very specific kinds of theoretical frameworks and methodological approaches that could be engaged in other contexts, right? I think that there is this sort of sense that it is not applicable, and therefore we don't really need to engage with it. And I think that that's something that scholars in our field really have to work against. And I think on the other end of it, we also have to think about our relationship to Latin American studies. And in some ways, we have no choice, because when we talk about issues of migration in particular, right, there's no way to talk about Latino studies and not talk about Latin America, right? But we have to do a better job of thinking about what are those overlaps there. And certainly a lot of my work is thinking about that now in terms of thinking about transnational media and how people in the US are interpreting, for example, Latin American media and vice versa. And in a digital media environment, sometimes it's hard to even parse out, right, those geographical spaces, because they may be interacting in ways that they weren't previously. So those are, I think some of the things that we need to think about going forward. But I think it's an exciting time at the same time. There's so many more of us.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to what extent do you think it shapes the kinds of questions you ask and the topics you choose?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always makes me attuned to thinking about movement and circulation, right? So thinking about how do media texts move, right, across different kinds of geographic boundaries, but also thinking about it in terms of literally in terms of people, right? So thinking about these questions of not only migration from Latin America to the US, but also circular migration and the return, which happens more often than we think in certain contexts. Here I'm thinking about, of course, the Puerto Rican context, but even the Salvadoran experience, where in problematic ways, right, children of migrants, right, have been pushed back into El Salvador. So I think, those questions of movement and circulation are big for me. Certainly the transnational, but also thinking about, this larger theme of how do you deal with heterogeneity, racially, ethnically, linguistically, we tend to think of Latinos in Latin America as so generic, right? But those of us who study it, I sometimes think, I'm not really sure how people think it's a narrow field, because you're talking about so many people that have such varying, experiences, right? Depending on where they're from. And so, yeah, so I think that question of heterogeneity is really important. I mean, even I look at, the sort of discourses that happen in the US, for example, just about, talking about like mixed race identities as if they're new, but that isn't the case. It isn't the case in the US, but it certainly hasn't been the case in Latin America. And so much, thinking and writing has already been done about that. So yeah, that question, that theme of heterogeneity always is a way in which I think about work in communication.
Excellent. And since you mentioned that this is the third generation, there's clearly history now. What advice would you give to graduate students who are beginning to think about dissertation topics, ideas, problems to consider, who are interested in these problematics and in this particular space?
Yeah, advice I would give is, one, don't do it all at once. And I say that because right now we're in a moment where, media has always shifted so much, but particularly now, even with the pandemic, right? For example, there's like media production has shifted in a way that we never would have anticipated. And so I think it's very easy to think of a lot of different things that we need to look at. So, keep your list going, and eventually maybe you will get to some of those projects. But you need to stay, I think, make it feasible for yourself. And so figure out, like, what am I going to focus on right now? Knowing that you can take a look at those, other issues or topics at some other point. I would also say too, I think it's really important to be engaged in communities of scholars, particularly now with the pandemic. I sometimes think like, wow, it must be so difficult to start a graduate program right now, right? To have started last fall, because so much of the graduate student experience is about creating community, with the scholars on your campus, and certainly with, the other students who are in your classes. So I think that you have to make even more of an effort, which is why I really appreciate like the talks that all of you are hosting. That's been really wonderful. But I think, yeah, students have to really go out of their way to make those communities and really get the mentoring that you need, because you may be lucky like myself. I had a wonderful advisor. Angela Valdivia was my advisor. She was amazing. But, she was not the only person, and you cannot only depend on one person to do that. So it's important too, to make sure that you're meeting other, scholars in the field, and not just super senior people, but you also want to know the more junior assistant professors, because they've been on the job market more recently. And so they can give you sometimes a better sense of what to expect when you're going on these interviews, because they do shift sometimes, right? Like the questions change, or sometimes the materials that they're asking for can change over time. And so some of those younger scholars have a better sense of that.
Excellent, excellent. And now, going from the very beginning of one's scholarly career to the field as a whole, if you had magical powers and could be granted one wish about how you'd like the field of communication and media studies to change, what would you wish for?
I really, really would hope that Latino media studies would have more resources. And by resources, I mean more job lines. As much as like we've been growing, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of institutions, for example, that are like, centers for, Latino media, but there's no expert there, right? So, thinking about those kinds of resources in terms of jobs, but also too, in terms of grant opportunities. There are not as many grant opportunities as there should be for this kind of work. And so I'm really thinking about it in terms of those resources. I think that's really important to ensure that we have a pipeline, but also too that, within the larger field, that our colleagues know that, our work exists and they know the value of it.
Okay, now let me ask you a follow-up question. Because in the U.S. context, basically 1 every 5 people are Latina or X, right? But as you say, I mean, in terms of the scholarly production, in terms of the lines, in terms of the grant funding, etc., it's not 20% or 18%. So why do you think that's the case? And what could be done to sort of fast track that?
Yeah, I mean this is the key question, right? I mean, I think some of it is that it's just awareness and people not recognizing how large the Latino community is, and even at institutions, for example, where there's a very large, Latino, like local community or student, or who are like Hispanic serving institutions, for example. So I think that a lot of it is about awareness. I think also, recognizing that the work that we do is not, it's not just for us, so to speak, as Latino media scholars, or even for our Latino students, but these are really the perspectives and frameworks that would benefit everyone in the field. And also that I see work getting reproduced in ways that it shouldn't be, because people haven't read the work in our field. So I think I think a lot of it is awareness needs to happen, and also, recognize and really, bringing more attention to the kinds of concepts and frameworks that are really useful in understanding Latino communities, but also can be useful from a more comparative perspective too, right? In terms of thinking about non-Latino communities.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Jillian. This has been a truly fascinating conversation. I want to thank also our listeners for staying with us to the end, and invite everybody to stay tuned for the next episode of El Café Latinx. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
El Café Latinx is a production of the Center for Latinx Digital Media in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. I am Pablo Boczkowski, your host, and I'm joined by executive producer Mora Matassi.